So the next guest on the Giant Minds podcast was someone who was relatively easy to get hold of because all I needed to do was walk down to the other end of the office. It's Alex Potter, who is one of the team at Ghyston. He is our head of technical excellence and really the authority in the company on our embracing of new technologies and how we standardize those and bring them into the business. So there's going to be some technical chat here. Hopefully that won't put you off. We'll try and keep it accessible. But it's really about how we can get a team working effectively, in particular a software development team, working effectively using the latest, greatest tools available. I hope you enjoy. Alex, thanks very much for joining us on the Giant Minds podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have a fellow Ghystonian to chat to this time for a change. And a really good opportunity for us to dive into some of the stuff we do here at Ghyston and how we do it and why we do it that way. Because I think a lot of people are quite interested, especially at the moment, in kind of how that's changing and evolving with all the emerging tool sets and different things that are going on in the industry. So I guess I should probably just start with a refresher for people who are listening who maybe don't know that much about Ghyston. So we develop software for other people. We generally develop quite enterprise grade software, so stuff that is pretty complex, has a lot of arms to it, a lot of connectivity into other systems, and needs to be quite future-proof and solid and robust and resilient and secure, all those sorts of things, which makes it harder to apply some of the new fad fancy tool sets, right?
Yeah, so a lot of the early hype was around what people call vibe coding, which I think is really good at coming up with things really quickly and moving very fast and iterating. It's perfect for things like prototypes, and it's good for proof of concepts and those sorts of things. But when you get to the more complicated things that you've mentioned there, the things that are needing to work in very serious environments and actually be fundamental parts of people's businesses, then there's a bit more rigor that you need around the stuff that's coming out of the AI. And I think actually it's funny because in recent times, so there was the editor that came out recently from Amazon, if you saw that, called Kiro, I think it's how you pronounce it. And that is kind of carving out this new path, which is almost the opposite of vibe coding, which is more specification driven. So people are calling it spec driven development. And it's a lot more around coming up with a really concrete plan and a really rigorous plan before starting to work and actually produce outputs from the AI. And it almost feels as though people are realizing some of the limitations of kind of the vibe coding way of working and figuring out, hey, there's a spectrum here. It's great at one end to use vibe coding for fast things and quick things that we don't need to be as robust, but there's actually a need for tools that can be applied on more serious projects.
Yeah, and that seems to be quite sort of a spectrum. I like the way that you say, for prototypes and sort of getting some proof of concepts off the ground, it can be really useful to use some of the more vibe coding tools. So we're talking things like Lovable Replit in particular, I think is kind of one that we're finding quite a lot of success with for those sort of simple, get up and go, show what's the art of the possible, try something out, put it in front of users. To me, if we start talking about sort of that early end of the development life cycle, if you like, to me it seems like the clickable prototype is dead. Like we used to have very static prototypes going way back, where you just have wireframes that you would look at and see if it might work. I remember even showing those sorts of things to people to like print it out, and they would press with their finger where they used to and you'd then give them another piece of paper. So those were the early days, and we moved through clickable prototypes, and it feels like we're now really at the next stage where you can just build a working piece of software that proves the point. It's not something you put into production, but it proves the point more effectively.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a lot of value in having something that is not a kind of straw man. It's something that actually is doing something behind the scenes. And I think another really interesting part of that way of working and producing prototypes in that way is that you can do a lot of de-risking around the technical aspects, which wireframes are great for communicating to the customer and building a shared understanding of what it is you're building. I think now that we can quickly build prototypes that are actually functional code is going a long way towards saying this is actually something that we could build because we've done some of it already. And we need to be careful, obviously, to caveat that these things that we spit out quite quickly are not going to be the things that we would want to put into production. And there is a step, like you say, we might throw away that code. It may well be that it's good enough to to work with and to form the foundation of something that is then a more serious piece of software. But it's important to remember that these things are often hanging together by a thread. These things that get spat out at quite an early stage, and it's important to realize that yes, it is possible, and we have demonstrated that we can do this, but we're still a long way from something we'd want to put into production.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how it's potentially redefining user testing a little bit though, because it's taking it from user testing as like a guided interview experience through to actually you can now give someone something that they can actually try and use for their day job, in a confined environment where you know that you're kind of being careful about things and watching out for edge cases and all the rest of it. But you can actually genuinely use it to perform a task rather than just try it out and give your feedback. It seems like quite a significant next step.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's the dream of Agile, right? Is that you're putting something into someone's hands as early as possible, and you're accepting that it's not going to be perfect and it's not going to be the end solution, but shortening that feedback cycle and having a much quicker development loop means that things can get built much faster, people can realize the value much sooner, and actually, it's just it's Agile times 100, right?
Yeah, definitely. Great, and I think naming tools here, I think Replit's the one that we're kind of seeing the most success with at the moment, and are kind of putting our weight behind more than any others. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of tools that are emerging, and there's always going to be another tool that comes down the line. I think the important thing is, as a business, to start trying something and not wait for the perfect thing. Replit has been really great for us so far, and that's what we're sticking with. It's not to say that we might switch to something else.
Ask us again in 3 months. The answer might not be the same.
Yeah. The landscape is shifting, and I think that is a real challenge. But the important thing is to kind of grasp that opportunity now and just start using stuff. And Replit has been good for us so far. Yeah,
great. Okay, and so moving on into sort of more serious development, when you're actually sort of going back to the art of crafting code. The tools there are fairly varied. There seems to be some quite different approaches. So you mentioned the sort of spec-driven development kind of approach that's emerging from Kiro and is kind of being backed that way. There's some more kind of blend of vibe coding and real coding in inverted commas sort of coming out of different players as well. What's your sort of overview of the landscape there?
So I think the important thing to realize is that all of these tools are just tools, and I think you can use any of the tools to do any of the things. So you can use a tool like Windsurf to do vibe coding style development. You can also use a tool like Windsurf to do more of a spec-driven development. I think the thing that distinguishes the different options is the way that they're geared towards one style or another, and actually the way that they set you up to do these things. So, for example, with Windsurf, it's one that we've been trying, and I've tried it out myself. And I was finding that I wanted to be doing more of the spec-driven development type thing. Before it had that name, it was an instinct that I need to be in chat mode for a while and talk to the AI and get it to plan something for me, and then ask it to jump into coding. But fundamentally, all of these editors are based on the same principle, which is that they are agent-based. There's AI models with tools that they can use to read your files and write to your files, and really the difference is the way that they set you up. So Kiro, for example, forces you more down a spec-driven development route, but you could be quite sort of rough and ready with that stage, and it would end up being a bit more of a vibe coding experience. So I've mentioned
is a blurred boundary between the two, really, isn't it? Because especially with a lot of the recent reasoning models that are coming out of all the main LLM players, that their general inbuilt approach is a little bit more spec driven anyway, because they tend to plan and then execute rather than do it all in one go.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it has some really interesting parallels with the early emergence of language models, which is, it feels like ancient history now. It probably wasn't that long ago. But if you remember when people initially started playing with language models, the thing that was really driving how good the results were was the prompting, right? And people were finding that there's actually techniques you can use. So rather than doing what people called a one-shot, where you just kind of say, do this thing without providing it any context, people realized over time that if you provide more detail before that question or the ask of the model, you get a much better response. And so I think it's interesting to see more of that being built into the models themselves, but it's also interesting to see that vibe coding, which is almost like one-shot prompting was back in the day, is now evolving into more of a spec-driven development style, which, again, drawing the parallel, is kind of going to few-shot prompting, where you provide more examples and things, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and it to some extent, it kind of feels a bit like pair programming, doesn't it? If you were saying earlier about being in chat mode for a while first, like that's kind of what you do when you're pairing, right? You kind of have a chat about how you're going to solve something, and then one of you starts hitting the keys. It kind of feels a little bit like that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a parallel that is often drawn with agents, AI agents and dev tools and sort of junior programmers. So the parallel that's drawn is basically treat it like a very eager and strangely deeply knowledgeable junior developer. So all of the same practices that technical leads will have learned in working with junior developers, coming up with a plan together, making sure you both understand it and you're happy with it, breaking down larger pieces of work into smaller pieces of work. These are all the same techniques that you use to work with agentic IDEs and with these language models in this way. So I think there's a lot to be said for realizing that parallel and kind of, leaning into the skills that people already have.
Yeah. And some of the tools, you think, sort of lend themselves more to that way of working, whereas some others are a little bit more prescriptive, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation. Like I say, tools like Kiro, which is fairly new at the time of recording, do lead you more down the route of planning and preparing. But I think, as I've said before, you can kind of adapt the way that you work with them to operate in whatever way you want. So a tool that we've been using quite a lot internally is a slightly less well-known tool called Ada, which is it's like a command line based pair programming tool. And one of the interesting features of that, which differs a little bit from the style of the other editors, is that you have a lot more control over what files are in context and what files are in scope. So you can put certain files into read-only mode so that the model can look at them, but it can't touch them. And you have other files that you can have in edit mode. So those are the ones that it can make changes to. So it's definitely on the spectrum more towards the end of control and precision. And I like to think of tools like Ada as more of a kind of a scalpel, whereas tools like Windsurf are more of a bazooka, right? I don't think you can argue that a bazooka is more powerful than a scalpel, but sometimes it's more appropriate to use a scalpel than to use a bazooka, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't want anyone performing open heart surgery on me with a bazooka. Yeah, great. Okay, and sort of naming names. What are we seeing the most success with out of the tools that are there? Because we've gone on a bit of a journey. I mean, the evolution of the tools, as we've sort of referenced a couple of times, is just so rapid at the moment. And we started off with GitHub Copilot. Was kind of one of the sort of early things to emerge, in which we latched onto pretty quickly. But the field's wide open since then, right?
Yeah, exactly. And going back to the point I made earlier, I think there's always going to be lots of options. The important thing is to try at least some of them. Try as many as you can, but at least try some of them. and start to adopt some of those tools quite seriously so that you can build a shared understanding of how to use them. So we trialed Windsurf, I've mentioned Ada, we're also looking at Claude Code. There have been people who've tried tools like Augment Code. There's one called Rue Code. And I think in general, the way that we've looked at it is it's easier to give people access to tools that are bring your own model, because there's lots of those tools in the space. So Ada, like I mentioned, to some extent, Claude Code you can configure with your own keys. Tools like Rue Code are set up to bring your own model. And what I mean by that is rather than having to give every developer a subscription to something, because we'd be managing 8,000 subscriptions right now if we gave everyone a Windsurf license and a Kiro license and a Cursor license. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to pick a few of those subscription-based ones, but largely look at some of the bring your own model ones, things like Ada, where you can configure it with a key that is managed centrally, and so we just have to generate keys for people and they can plug them into their tools and use them without any friction or red tape around asking, oh, can I have a license for this, that, or the other? Makes sense.
So it's a really interesting challenge that we face, and I imagine lots of listeners are facing, around experimentation versus standardization. And we've certainly had a period of like massive experimentation across a really getting wider and wider field. It's already a very wide field now, and now we've sort of been consolidating back to try and standardize into certain sort of default tools so that we can build that shared knowledge and understanding. What sort of hints and tips would you give to people listening around how best to manage that experimentation versus standardization dilemma?
So I think one of the main things I would say is that different people are going to have different learning curves, right? There's going to be some people who get on really well with these tools straight away, and those are the sort of people that you need to identify quite early on. The early adopters, the people who are really good at trying new things and not fearing change, pushing the boundaries, get them on board. Those are the people who can cast the net wide. They're not going to mind trying 5 to 10 different tools. That's not going to disrupt them too much. Get them working on that and get some feedback from them. Base your next steps off the early indications. So which tools are looking the most promising? Get more people working with those tools, get more feedback, and it's a loop like anything else. It's a feedback process. And really the key is that different things are going to work differently for different people. But we've managed to get consensus on some of the tools that people like. And I think that's really the first stage towards adopting something. And then once you've adopted something, it's not like you're, writing something in stone and that can never change. But you've then got a launch pad to bring other people in. And I think that once you've got something that some people in the organization are bought into, that gives it credibility, right, with other people. And you can overcome a bit of skepticism from other people about the tools because you've got advocates for it. Yeah. And meanwhile, all those trailblazers are still blazing their trail. They're still trying all the new things. And over time, you can maybe adjust your position. But I think it's important not to wait forever, right, for the perfect thing. It's find out what's working for people right now, get it in people's hands as quickly as possible, and go from there.
Yeah, iterate and improve is the sort of standard software development technique.
Absolutely.
But I think it's a really interesting point you raised there around the fact that people often mistakenly think that all techies, by nature of being technophiles, are sort of big experimenters and always playing with new tech. There's actually sort of a range in there, isn't there? You find some people love that sort of newness and experimentation and chaos, and other people actually need a lot more sort of stability and security and certainty around where they're going and how they're doing it, and they like to know that they're doing it right, and that's kind of important to the way that they craft. And I think this is highlighted among this process is highlighted among the team. how some people are very much on the mastery end of the spectrum and like to be really good at doing a certain thing in the right way, and other people sit much more on the sort of discovery and adventure end of things and just love exploring different stuff. And I think the sort of emergence of AI has only really started to show me how different people in the tech team can be in their approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's really valuable to have that range, just to put that out there first. I think we, as a business, succeed because we have such a range of diversity in thought. And I think it's important to have the people who are very meticulous and very details focused. And I think it's also important to have the people who are much more comfortable with moving quickly, right? I think that's something that's important to say.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's been interesting to work out how best to bring along those people who don't like uncertainty and chaos, who like a bit more stability. It seems like the biggest ingredient we've had on that is sort of advocacy and leaning on the trust that those people have in some of the other tech leaders in the organisation. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think another thing is recognising the people who find it hard to, they might have really well-established ways of working that they've developed over years. And it is a lot to ask of people to completely, change all of that in an instant. So as well as the advocacy, which I think is definitely a crucial part, I think having a gentle ramp onto these new tools is actually a really important thing as well. So we've been using Copilot quite extensively for a very long time now. I dread to think how long. But we adopted that fairly early on.
As you think.
I think there was a bit of skepticism at first around that, which was normal. But over time, it wasn't such a huge change, and people managed to get on board with it. And I think now that Copilot is evolving and becoming more powerful, that's a good route in with people. They already have Copilot. They don't need to install anything extra. It works in their IDE. They're not having to step out into some other entirely different tools. So that's a really good route. Similarly, with things like Ada, which are in your terminal, people are used to working in the terminal. It's not fiddling too much around with their editor, so they can more easily adapt to that. I think one of the challenges we've had with things like Windsurf and Cursor and the other Visual Studio clones is that we're very much a JetBrains company. We use all the JetBrains products, and people feel very comfortable with those. So there's been big pain points having to kind of completely step out of your editor into a different editor and get to use that. So wrapping it all up, I suppose what I'm trying to say is making too many changes in one go is not useful. Some people who are comfortable with that, go for it. Mm-hmm. The rest of us trying to find small steps that we can take towards those more powerful tools that are not going to be enormous changes to the dev processes all in one go. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does, yeah. So there's also some emerging tool sets that basically run as background agents. They're not necessarily things that you control directly, but more like assigning a ticket to a person, and then the AI just kind of picks it up and acts like a person in the background. What do you think of those, and kind of how that might shift the landscape?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think that it's maybe a little bit too early to comment on some of the abilities of these agents to do work completely autonomously. But I think that where some of the more interesting feature sets lie is in around things like reviews. So, for example, GitHub, I believe, is doing a lot of work in this space where you can get automatic AI reviews on pull requests and things like that. That sort of thing is a very low risk kind of integration of these sorts of agents, because there's no harm in something going away and doing a pull request and not doing a great job of it. You'd probably also have a human step in the process. But it's gradually shifting the amount of work away from the humans involved and moving it over to the AIs. So I know there's other tools which can, as you say, be assigned, say, a bug ticket and go away and actually make some changes to the code base and raise a pull request for that change. I think there's obviously a lot of things that could go wrong in that process. I think that for smaller well-defined things and things like bug requests, as long as you've got processes in place to do the right reviews and to ensure that the fixes are correct, that can be a real time saver. I think for more serious feature development and things like that, it's maybe still a little ways away. I think that it relies a lot on, harking back to the spec-driven development discussion, it relies a lot on the detail being there in the ticket, right? And having a good plan, because one of the things that I think human beings are still going to be really essential for is navigating uncertainty and ambiguity, right?
Yeah.
Making those decisions.
Yeah, and I think both that and the spectrum development example and just the general concept that we're just writing less code these days is all just highlighting the fact that the core kind of responsibility of a software engineer is also always has been, but is even more around defining good and defining that in a way that that has an impactful kind of result afterwards. So I think that it seems like that skill's not going away, both from a functional perspective and from a sort of technical perspective. Defining what good architecture looks like, what robustness looks like, what extensibility looks like, all the rest of it. Thinking about what makes deployability good, but also the behavioural stuff and like how things are going to act. So it feels like holding on to those skills in our engineers and sort of really focusing on them is going to be really important going forwards.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the way that I like to think about it is there's a difference between a software engineer and a programmer, right? This is the way that I think about it. This is not prescriptive, but in my head, a programmer is someone who can write code based on a very specific problem, whereas a software engineer is someone who has a much wider scope, right? It's not just about writing the code, it's about understanding what is important, understanding what the business drivers are, understanding the non-functional requirements, how secure does this need to be, making trade-offs, all of these things. That is where a human being's judgment is essential. And so retaining people with that mindset and with the almost the product mindset is going to be really important, especially as AI kind of develops and like you say, we end up writing less code and more specifications.
Yeah, cool. One of the tools that we're using internally, so alongside the software development, sort of the AI-assisted software development tools, if you like, is a much more generic tool, which is around just sort of an open access LLM hub that we give everyone in the organization access to. I thought it would just be useful to talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of people listening might be interested in how they could deploy this into their own organizations. So do you want to just kind of describe it to listeners to start with?
Yeah, so to begin with, there's a few key challenges around giving people access to AI, especially to large language models. As I mentioned earlier, there's the problem of managing subscriptions, managing access, all of those things. And really what we've wanted to do is give people access to as many models as we can, right? There's providers, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google Gemini, there's, you name it. There's lots of stuff coming out. And what we wanted was a way of allowing our staff to access those models securely, with no friction, and in a way that we could manage centrally. So with all of that context aside, what we've got is using a couple of open source pieces of software. So in the background, we've got a thing called Lite LLM, which is a language model proxy. So what this does is it essentially acts as an entry point. You communicate with that, and then that will communicate with all of the different providers that you've hooked up. So we've got, like I say, OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini, we've got DeepSeek models, multiple different providers. And what that allows us to do is essentially just set those things up once and connect them to the hub. And then everyone can talk to the hub rather than having to have their own subscriptions. But what we've done as well as that is we've stuck a thing called Open Web UI on the front of it. And that's really the thing that allows us to have a ChatGPT-like chat interface which has access to all of these models. So we've hosted it ourselves, we've secured it with our company SSO, and people can have access to that, and that will give them access to all the models they want. We get things like cost tracking, we can see usage per user. It's all secure because it's all going through paid subscriptions. Completely avoids any kind of shadow IT problems, red tape around people getting access. New models come along, we can just add them straight in. Everyone gets them with no extra work.
Sure. And from a sort of business owner's perspective on this, what it means to me is that ongoing cost is massively reduced because we pay per use on this platform, which compared to giving everyone in the company access to subscriptions with Claude, with OpenAI, with Gemini, with however many you want to name, like they're all just there, and the comparative cost is really, really low, right? And also the other big benefit to me is being able to sleep at night, really knowing about the security of all these things. So I think the best example of that is that OpenAI recently came under a court order where they basically have to store all the stuff that goes through their systems, and that is actually in breach of GDPR and a major security threat and around data sensitivity and that sort of thing. So we have a company-wide directive not to use OpenAI for that reason, for anything remotely sensitive. But using this setup, we've been able to redirect from the OpenAI APIs through Azure OpenAI, which doesn't fall under the same jurisdictions and restrictions, therefore keeping it all secure whilst giving everyone access to all the same latest models.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really easy, transparent way of managing things. Like you say, you can sleep easier at night knowing that it's all secure. And there's actually other benefits we get from this setup as well, which I sort of alluded to earlier, which is around issuing API keys. So as well as having an ability to go into the OpenWebUI interface and chat with the models through there, developers can actually generate OpenAI compatible API keys from there, and they can use it as though they were talking to the OpenAI APIs. And so that's where we get the ability to use these bring your own model tools. So you generate the API key once and you can use it across all of your tools. It can talk to all the different models. So that's been a really big win for developer ease of use as well as for wider adoption in the company and non-technical roles.
And another important evolution of it is that we then can augment the standard LLMs with our own internal data that we hold in various different stores. So we can kind of connect in all the different sources, and you can ask the chatbots about stuff to do with the company which isn't in the public domain. So that's obviously a great advance as well. One of the ways in which we can do that and connect it up to other things is potentially to add MCP servers into the system.
Yeah, absolutely. So MCP servers, it's funny because we had a conversation a little while ago when we were going to do this podcast a little while ago. And at that stage, it was quite early on with MCP servers. And we were making jokes around, the S stands for security and things like that. It's funny looking back on that because they really are not going away. They're definitely developing and becoming more of a thing. And there's a lot more going on in terms of the work around security and things like that. But yeah, the crux of it is that previously there wasn't really a standard for giving models access to information, and not just giving it access to information, but giving it access to perform operations, right? Take actions by itself. And as agents have become more of a thing, there's been a need to standardize that interface, right? So for those who aren't aware, MCP servers, MCP standing for Model Context Protocol, and the P is the important bit here. It's a standardization. So it's a protocol that allows people to write integrations against a single spec, and then all the different model providers that adopt that standard can talk to it. So it's not just things like OpenWebUI where we can hook in MCP servers, but actually some of the development tools that we're using as well. So Claude Code, for example, has the ability to hook up MCP servers, and that's really exciting because that unlocks the possibilities to do things like update a ticket from your editor or raise a pull request and do these sorts of things without having to go away and context switch, but also giving the agents the ability to interact with these things, pull information from tickets, look at the state of something in DevOps, make that part of its kind of autonomous work. And that's just like a really cool, really exciting thing.
Yeah, it's cool, sort of taking it all to the next level. And building these internal systems where you have access to all the latest models. You can internally host models as well if you want to, and giving them access to the whole organization. That's obviously a service and a product that we can provide to people, and just come in and set that up for people and connect it to different different data sources and so on. So yeah, if anyone listening is interested in that, that's my little sales pitch of the podcast. I won't go any further into it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The protocol is clear, and actually what's happening is that organizations are building MCP servers that integrate with their tools, and the idea is that they ship those and then you host them. But obviously, if you've got a bespoke in-house system that's, a line of business system, you're not going to get someone else just dropping an MCP server for that into your lap. You're going to need to build that, or if you need, we can build that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, it's been a brilliant conversation. Thanks very much, Alex. I'm sure we'll have to do this again in 6 months because the whole landscape will have changed and it'll all have moved on.
Yep.
But hopefully that's been really useful to a lot of people listening. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.